Welcome to another episode of our video series of the critique of modern systems.
It's good to be back. How was your week? Did you manage to clear the desk?
I did, thank you. But my mind is still sort of stuck on this specific economic puzzle we're about to get into.
Oh.
Yeah. For years, the whole national conversation has been absolutely fixated on this huge symbolic figure, the management of foreign exchange reserves, often referenced by that 128 billion mark.
Mm-hmm.
So what I want to do today is move past the number itself and really try to understand the fundamental anxiety. Why is there such a pervasive, almost cultural fear of currency scarcity and value loss?
That anxiety it's the perfect starting point. Because to even begin talking about reserves, we have to place the central bank in a much, much bigger context.
It's not just an accounting office.
Not at all. I mean, we see a functioning society as being built on these 6 pillars, a sort of civilization cycle. You have philosophy, science, law, art, culture, and, of course, money.
And the central bank is right there in the middle of it all.
It's deeply linked to all of them. It needs scientific expertise to function, it's governed by law, and it's hugely affected by the national culture around, say, saving and spending.
So if the CB is a pillar, its integrity is absolutely essential. And that immediately brings up this idea of ownership and trust, which feels more philosophical than economic at first.
But it's central to the economics.
Right, because the funds managed by the central bank, they belong to the Treasury. And the Treasury belongs to the state, to the republic.
Precisely. And if we're a republic, then every single citizen, all 83 million of them, owns a direct share of those assets. The very soil we stand on, the curbstone on the street, and the reserves in the bank. They're collectively owned.
Yet there's this profound cultural disconnect, a feeling that it belongs to them, not us.
We do. We see it in this very damaging societal perception. It's often called sahipsiz mal elgis.
The perception of ownerless property.
Exactly. When citizens look at public assets and think they belong to no one instead of everyone, it just opens the door for misuse, and it completely erodes any public willingness to defend those institutions.
And that failure to acknowledge ownership, that seems to tie into a much deeper cultural pattern, doesn't it?
It does. It can be a symptom of being sort of stuck in an older pre-Republican mindset. Some sources call it a culture of submission or Biatkultur. It prevents people from acknowledging their rightful legal claim to public assets. And when you lose trust in your own institutions, that loss of faith is more economically destructive than almost any external shock.
Okay, let's pivot to the mechanics of money itself then. Because that lack of trust fuels this anxiety about scarcity. When people panic, they imagine literal pallets of banknotes just running out.
And that's the fundamental misunderstanding. Money today is far more abstract. It's an institutional, psychological, and, well, an ontological thing. It's about its very nature. It's being, look, if you count up all the physical cash in circulation in the country right now, it's only about $25 billion equivalent.
Okay.
But the total recorded, virtual, registered money, everything on ledgers, in deposits, digital transfers, that's closer to 415 billion. The physical cash is less than 5% of the total.
That really puts the whole running out of cash idea into perspective.
It shows that the central bank's real power is psychological. If the CB is credible, truly credible, it shouldn't need massive interventions. Its reputation, its very word, should be enough.
So you just need
to raise an eyebrow or make a few phone calls to the major players in the market, and things should snap back into place. That's what credibility gives you.
And that authority rests on its mandate. The CB was granted independence 2 decades ago. Why was that move so critical?
Independence was given for one single, non-negotiable reason: to achieve price stability.
Which is just a technical term for managing inflation.
It's about making sure the value of your money is predictable. The price of bread, say, shouldn't double overnight. It should increase slowly, predictably, maybe around 2% a year. That's the global target. It allows people and businesses to plan.
And independence, structurally, is based on those 3 pillars.
Yeah.
Controlling its own budget, writing its own regulations, and managing its own appointments.
Exactly. If those are secure, the CB can apply clear economic logic without outside interference.
And that's the critical link, isn't it? Logic, the ability to see cause and effect.
It is the absolute foundation. Philosophers like Aristotle taught that to live a truly human life, you need logic to move beyond just basic needs. In economics, logic is the ability to correctly distinguish the cause of a problem from its result.
And if you break that logical chain, If policymakers confuse the symptom for the disease,
You get flawed policy.
yeah.
Every time you end up with interventions that just don't work. And for years, the central bank has been fighting two huge structural flaws that require flawless logic. We can call them the dual tsunami.
Okay, let's define these two tsunamis, these structural problems that make the job so difficult no matter who's in charge.
The first is the chronic trade deficit. And this is an old problem. Some sources trace it all the way back to the 1838 Baltalimana Agreement.
Wow.
For most of our history, imports have outweighed exports. Structurally, this means the country is always short on foreign currency. The system perpetually needs more FX coming in, from tourism, from borrowing, just to stay afloat.
So the CB is already fighting an uphill battle every single day.
A guaranteed uphill battle. So that anxiety about scarcity isn't just a modern political talking point. It's baked into the system's history.
And the second tsunami.
High dollarization, which is really just another term for the erosion of trust, when over half of all bank deposits in the entire country are held in a foreign currency.
That's a massive vote of no confidence in your own currency.
It's a profound signal of mistrust. And it creates this huge, constant domestic demand for foreign currency that the CB is then forced to counteract. It just compounds the first problem.
Which brings us right to the core of the ideological conflict. The debate over fees, over interest rates. Is interest the cause of all the trouble, or is it the result?
Well, the global consensus on this was settled decades ago. High interest rates are not the cause of an economic problem. They're a symptom. They're a price signal.
A result of what?
A result of high inflation and perceived risk. And the analysis shows that the true root cause, almost always, is a lack of sustainable production. When a country doesn't produce enough value, it has to borrow more, risk goes up, and so the cost of borrowing, the interest rate, has to go up to compensate.
So what happens when the CB, maybe due to ideological pressure or that logical failure we talked about, resists using its best tool, raising rates to fight that risk? Say, when the market is screaming for 24% and rates are held at 14%.
When you take your primary tool off the table, you're forced to use a much less effective, much less sustainable option: direct FX intervention, selling your reserves. And that policy choice led directly to the depletion we were talking about.
Let's get into the mechanics of that. How exactly were those reserves spent?
Well, over about 18 months, the central bank sold huge portions of its foreign currency reserves. It did this to satisfy that massive public and corporate demand for FX, which was being driven by, high inflation and that lack of trust.
And these weren't just spare funds sitting around.
No. A huge part of what was sold was what we call eminent duviz custody funds. This is the FX that came from exporters, from tourists, from investors. It was supposed to be held securely as a core asset, a buffer. Instead, it was used to manually manage the exchange rate day to day.
What's the estimated long-term cost of that choice?
The financial assessment is, it's really sobering. The effort and time it will take just to replenish those reserves, to get the central bank back to a position of strength, it has put the country under a financial constraint that's roughly equivalent to 25 years of economic struggle.
25 years.
Of severe, painful belt tightening.
And the immediate results just highlight the failure. The whole point was to achieve stability and lower interest rates, but today, market rates are still high, inflation is still high.
It was like applying a Band-Aid to a deep structural wound. You can't solve a production problem with a short-term cash injection. The moment you stop intervening, those structural forces, the trade deficit, the dollarization, they just come roaring back.
So if monetary policy tools are just temporary fixes, where does real sustainable economic power actually come from?
Sustainable power, if you look at any global leader, flows from three main sources. First, and most important, is production and cultural capital creating wealth, intellectual property, trusted institutions.
Right.
Second is military and security power, which is a necessary foundation for stability. And third is deep institutional knowledge and policy support.
But the very start of that chain, to bring it back to the beginning, is in philosophy and science, things that feel very far removed from central banking.
But they're not. They're the source. The economic problems we see every day, high food prices, those chronic deficits, they all trace back to a failure to invest in the foundations. Creating a climate of philosophy, of free inquiry, which feeds into science, real research, new technology, better seeds, which then drives competitive production. If you break that primary cycle, you're just doomed to constantly borrow, to constantly worry about FX, and to forever debate symptoms instead of the actual cause.
Which highlights this massive risk. when a society starts prioritizing quick returns or guaranteed professions for its kids over deep, fundamental investment in science.
It is the single biggest risk to the nation's future, to its istiqbal. If we fail to fund the basic research in physics, chemistry, biology, we will fail to create the innovations we need to compete. The whole country risks falling into poverty because we'll be stuck here arguing about temporary fixes while the entire foundation just crumbles away.
So, to bring this all together for you, the listener, the crisis we've been discussing isn't really about one number. It's about a breakdown in trust, a resistance to proven economic logic, and this deep structural imbalance that's been built up over centuries. We have to apply logic to see the real cause and effect chain.
And we have to accept that some economic rules are, for all intents and purposes, settled. Just as we all accept that driving through a red light will probably cause an accident, we have to accept the principles that connect production, trust, and interest rates. And any political system, I don't care about its ideology, it naturally starts to deform and become less effective if it stays in power too long without renewal, especially beyond a decade. You need strong institutions to fight that natural decay.
And that decay keeps us trapped in this cycle.
It does. And the problems we've explored today, that structural deficit, the FX anxiety, they will only truly be solved when the country fixes the root production problem. That means creating its own globally competitive champions, its own Amazons, Googles, or Apples, because that is the one action that eliminates the need to constantly borrow foreign currency. It's the only thing that will truly stabilize the system for good.